Ed.
Now to the deadly nationwide protests in Iran, where the demonstrations began late last week over economic issues in one city, then quickly spread all across the country. President Trump weighing in, tweeting, "Big protest in Iran. The people are finally getting wise as to how their money and wealth is being stolen and squandered on terror. Looks like they will not take it any longer. The USA is watching very closely for human rights violations." Someone else watching this story closely, Connor Powell, following all the developments live from our Mideast Bureau in Jerusalem. Connor, Happy New Year. What's happening?
Yeah, Ed, for the fifth straight day, Iranian protesters defying their government, taking to the streets not only in Tehran, but really across the entire country. And the crackdown on them appears to be intensifying. Iran's state media reporting hundreds of people have been arrested and at least 12 people have been killed in the last few days. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, a moderate in the Iranian political environment, has said that while the protests, he supports them in principle, he does not want protests that will turn violent. And he said that there are legitimate reasons and grievances about the state of affairs in Iran right now. Still, Iran's government, which while he's the president, he's not the only decision maker there, has blocked access to the internet and some social media sites over the weekend. President Trump and several other members of his administration have voiced strong support in both statements and tweets for the protesters. However, hardliners in Iran are trying to paint these protesters as paid agitators and pawns of the United States in an effort to delegitimize them. But these protests are unique, and they're not only much smaller than the ones we saw in 2009 during the Green Revolution. They are much more widespread, and the numbers still aren't there in comparison to 2009. But they are attacking not only the economic situation there, but also, Ed, they're going right at the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader there. This is unique, where in the past they've attacked the political system and the economic system. They're going right at the religious establishment as well, and that is something worthwhile paying attention to as we see what happens over the next couple of days.
You're right. Major development as 2018 begins. Connor Powell, thank you.
For more on the deadly protests in Iran, we are joined by Tom Rogan, who covers foreign policy and politics for the Washington Examiner. Thanks for joining us today. Kicking things off, these are the biggest protests since 2009. Those protests in 2009 about the re-election of then-President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. This is about more than just the economy. We just heard this report from Connor Powell talking about how this is much broader and has to do with the religious leadership there in the country and an effort to push back against that and to seek really an entirely different kind of future. Do the people have a chance of making a big change now versus in 2009 when things were shut down by the government at that point in time?
Well, the critical question, I think, as always with the revolution, is what do the security forces do? If the security forces remain loyal to the government, then it's very, very hard, especially in a place like Iran, for the people to render their will. And we see in Venezuela, for example, that the security forces have stayed loyal to the Maduro government, even as people are starving to death and taking to the streets in much larger numbers. So that's the first issue. I think the secondary point, though, is this is a signifier for something that I think is going to happen more often and ultimately will bring down the Iranian regime. And the simple point here is demographics and technology. Iran's population is very young, and it is very connected with the West for a variety of reasons. I suspect the United States has provided some support. It's noticeable, for example, in terms of where the Iranian government is taking offline different Wi-Fi servers. People are still finding ways to post videos. That's the kind of thing that makes it very hard to trample this down, as was the case in 2009.
Yeah, the authorities have warned that a tough crackdown could be coming. Meanwhile, President Trump and the White House have expressed support for the people there in Iran. We have a tweet that the president sent. He says, "Iran is failing at every level despite the terrible deal made with them by the Obama administration. The great Iranian people have been repressed for many years. They are hungry for food and for freedom, along with human rights. The wealth of Iran is being looted. Time for change." Could U.S. actions make a difference right now, and what could the U.S. possibly do?
I think that is I would wish the president made more. That's a great tweet, and he's right. And look, the food and freedom here, the basic level that Iran is very oil-rich, natural gas-rich, and yet and has seen this sanctions relief from the Iran deal. But of course, the theocrats in power and the hardliner elements, at least in foreign policy, have taken a lot of that money and put it in ways that haven't provided benefits to people. What can the United States do? Well, the first thing we should do, I think, is to be to let this be an indigenous uprising, to try and avoid having an American footprint, because that will damage the legitimacy of the Iranian people because of a coup that we sort of played a role in with the British in 1953. But secondly, we can provide supports behind the scenes in terms of providing Wi-Fi materials, smuggling in things. In the Obama administration, one thing it could get credit for, and probably the only one thing on Iran, is developing some kind of programs that actually provided for this sort of covert, allowing people to communicate in ways that through the internet that the government can trample down. So we should do more of that.
So some quiet undermining. Senator Lindsey Graham called on the president to do more than tweet, to really lay out a plan, and he has called for a withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, the president had roundly criticized that deal, that agreement. Is it time to withdraw from the deal?
No, I don't think so. I think the president has the correct course on this, which is to try and strengthen the weaknesses of the deal, which are snap inspections, access to military sites, and the ballistic missile side of things. If you can do that, that's important. But also, I think there's an opportunity here with these protests, in the sense that the Obama administration has given this sanctions relief, and by Trump saying, look, if we can make the deal better and the Iranian people can access these kind of, more productive investments through that money, then that's good. But if not, if we keep seeing this, then at a point further down the road, we are going to withdraw. And you use that also as a pressure point on the Europeans, because unless the Europeans jump on the side of the United States on this, it will be very hard to pressure the Iranian regime to change. But that is there's a big opportunity there, I think, for the president.
Tom, shifting gears now to North Korea. The leader there saying it's not a mere threat, but a reality. I have a nuclear button on the desk in my office. At the same time, he has made a push towards opening dialogue, at least with South Korea, moving forward. So let's kick off with this initial threat about having this button on his desk. Kim Jong-un says this is a reality, not just a threat. Should the U.S. take this as an escalation? And how should we respond? How should the country, our leadership, respond?
Well, I don't think we should see it as an escalation. I think North Korea, American preemptive nuclear power is far superior. The North Koreans, command and anyway, without getting into the weeds on it, we can destroy them much more easily and efficiently than they can destroy us. So, I mean, if they start fueling and putting warheads on missiles, they will disappear. The point, though, I think here of concern is the specific outreach to South Korea. I think that is motivated much more by Beijing. The Chinese want to weaken the resolve of the United States in pushing for tougher action and potentially military action, because they know if they can suck South Korea away, then the United States is out on its own. And I've always come down, I don't buy the idea, and I think the president is warming up to this understanding. I've never believed that China really was that interested in helping us in North Korea, because quite frankly, it helps them to have us in a position of difficulty, and they know that Kim Jong-un is never going to attack them. So, a million refugees come across the border, what do they care? They'll just let them die as they ran people over in tanks in Tiananmen Square. We have to be rational about the nature of the regimes we are dealing with.
China certainly has their own strategic interests as well. After virtually ignoring the South for years, now Kim Jong-un has said he's reaching out to the South and wants to start a dialogue. Why now? Is this a signal that the sanctions are working?
I think to some degree, but I also think it's an opportunity that the Chinese have been improving their relations with the South Koreans in recent months. Unfortunately, I think President Moon of South Korea is losing his nerve in this battle of wills. And so it's an opportunity, again, to sever the United States from South Korea, in the belief that if South Korea is not willing to take military action, that Trump will have to back down to that. I think the one good thing here is President Trump, far more than most other leaders, is not someone who tends to follow in the grain of people plotting to manipulate him. So, at least on this issue. So I think the Chinese hopefully will be very disappointed.
All right. Well, we've covered quite a bit of geopolitical ground here. Tom Rogan, thanks for joining us, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
All right. Meanwhile, in Colorado, new details emerging about the gunman who shot and killed a sheriff's deputy and wounded 4 others. Police say Matthew Reel was an Iraq War veteran who holed himself up in his bedroom before firing 100 rounds at officers who were responding to a complaint about noise. 2 civilians also wounded. Authorities say Real had ranted about the local sheriff and police on social media leading up to the ambush-style attack. Real was shot during the incident and died at the scene.
A new year means higher wages for some workers as many states bump up their minimum wage for 2018. A look at where this is happening next. Plus, the GOP tax bill is now in effect. What it means for your bottom line still ahead.
The tax cut that we just passed, historic in its nature, is going to allow more Americans to keep their money and not send it up here to Washington, D.C.
Minimum wage workers in 18 states ringing in the new year with a boost in their paychecks. With the federal minimum wage remaining $7.25 per hour, more and more states have opted to implement their own higher rates that local employers must observe. Many of the bumps beginning in the new year come courtesy of recent ballot initiatives approved by voters or bills passed by state houses in red and blue states alike.
Meanwhile, President Trump's biggest legislative win so far now in effect with the start of the new year. Today is when the Republican tax reform bill, yes, officially becomes law, or at least takes effect. So how big of a win was this for the GOP? Joining me now, Gabriel DeBenedetti. He's Politico's national political reporter. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Ed.
So the Democrats seemed to be effective during the debate, at least early on, in saying this is about the rich. It's not going to help the middle class. The president, before he left for Florida a couple weeks back, said, look, I'm not going to have to go out and sell this. Once, people start getting fatter paychecks in February, at least that's when the IRS says withholding will take impact. Is that going to start turning this around for the GOP?
That's certainly the GOP's hope right now. And, talking to a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill, they essentially say the same thing over and over, which is that this bill will sell itself once people start to see it in their paychecks. Once their wallets get a little bit thicker, they'll be happier with it. And then, all the negative talk about the GOP tax bill will move to the side. Democrats, however, aren't going to just shut up about this, of course. Right. Democrats want this to be a negative tax bill. They want Republicans to get more and more unpopular. And the reality is that for now, it's still an unpopular bill.
And on the House side of this, some of the swing districts in, say, California or New York, where you may have some moderate Republicans trying to hang on to a seat, the so-called SALT, the state and local taxes that are going to have, they're basically going up for some. Might that hurt the GOP in some of these big House seats?
Yes, absolutely. There are some seats in particular in, as you said, New York, New Jersey, California, that a lot of Republicans are very concerned about right now, specifically because of the difficulty that these local congressmen have in selling this bill to their constituents. Many of them, of course, did not support it, but it's going to be that much harder for them to try and thread the needle there politically. And when you have people going out there, like the other day you saw Florida Senator Marco Rubio say, I wish that we had done a little bit less for corporations in terms of selling this bill, that just makes it a little bit more difficult.
On the other hand, the Democratic talking point on the corporate tax cut from 35% to 21% was this is not going to trickle down to workers. Seems to me it's going to help the president and Republicans writ large that over the holidays, we've all heard about a lot of companies across many sectors saying, here's a bonus, we're going to hire more people, we're going to invest in our company. That seems to run counter to what Marco Rubio and a lot of Democrats said.
Sure, and that's why you see a lot of Democrats still out there pushing on this bill. They're not going to let this debate just end with what people read in the news. Democrats are out there saying over and over, A, these are temporary moves that these companies are making, and B, wait for the long run, see what your paycheck actually looks like, because these tax measures do expire. So, again, this is going to be a battle that's not over at all. It's going to keep going for a while.
Now, after the Republican failure on repeal and replacing Obamacare earlier this past year, we've now got to say that. We've got a new year here now. There was a lot of talk. The president's got to get this tax cut. He's got to get something done. Now that he has gotten that done, what are the 2 or 3 things you think he may need to get done to show, yes, in addition to the tax cut, Republicans can govern? Is it immigration? Is it infrastructure?
Well, that's the big question on his plate right now, and that's why he'll be meeting with a lot of congressional leaders over the next few days to try and figure out what the agenda really is. But first and foremost is government spending. They're going to have to figure out a way to keep the government open even longer than it currently is. And in that conversation are big questions about things like DACA, the immigration program, and how to fund that, whether to fund that. Democrats really want to pressure the president on that, but the president does want to move forward on plans like infrastructure. So the question there is, how is he going to be able to work with Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell? Are they all going to get on the same page here? They certainly hope so.
That government funding running out, as I recall, roughly January 21st. January 30th, I think I have circled on the calendar, which is another big day for the president, the State of the Union address. This is always an opportunity for a president, Democrat or Republican, to kind of reset things. What do you think this president is going to have to do? He seems like he has unique challenges going into 2018.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this president is not under any illusions that he's suddenly going to start making the Democrats like him at any point soon. But I think what you're going to start to see from the president over the next few weeks is really an attempt to get Republicans behind him and unify his party ahead of 2018, because he knows, and everyone in the White House knows, that 2018 could be pretty challenging for the Republican Party. But if they're all able to unite behind an agenda and all agree on what they're actually going to work on this year, well, that could at least start to get them moving in the right direction.
Now, I've heard some of the president's aides tell me in private that one thing they're thinking about for the State of the Union is kind of going back to the drain the swamp kind of rhetoric, that they got the tax cut done. Yeah, they'll be working on immigration and infrastructure, but this is less about bullet points and more about a big theme. He ran against the swamp. Now he's in Washington. It seems like it's important for him heading into the election to keep those Republicans, get them to stay home going into the midterms, to say, look, I'm trying to drain the swamp. Term limits, cracking down on lobbyists, other things like that.
That's absolutely a huge theme that he cares very deeply about, at least in public. He talks about this nonstop, and it does really help him with his base. But all I'll say about that is that it is tricky for him to try and navigate this politically, because the way that you've seen this play out in races all over the country so far this year is that a lot of Republican primary voters have read this as sort of an indictment of his own party's establishment. So you see it with Republican candidates sometimes running against Mitch McConnell, someone who they see as an embodiment of the swamp, however politically difficult that is. So it's a tough line for him to walk.
The same Republican leaders he needs on immigration, infrastructure, and the like.
Exactly.
Gabriel, appreciate it, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Molly?
Well, the bitter cold, a holdover from 2017 in many parts of the country, like in Chicago, where temperatures plunged into the single digits. When is it going to start warming up? Plus, 2018 starting off on a high note in one state with the legalization of recreational marijuana, where you can find these pot shops.
I felt like a little kid on Christmas Eve. Is Santa Claus coming or not, you know?
From the Midwest to the Northeast, bitter cold is what many people had to deal with as part of their New Year's Eve plans last night. In Chicago, temperatures were in the single digits, leaving some people not quite prepared.
We were ready. I don't think our faces were ready. We didn't bring anything to cover our faces, and that's what we're struggling with. But the more you move and the more pizza you eat, I think you'll make it.
So cold and want to be out in the cold and having fun.
Well, they do call it the Windy City, but maybe you could have been prepared. It was much the same in New York City as temperatures dropped to 9 degrees in Times Square, making it the second coldest ball drop in the city's history. And I can tell you,
You
Molly,
got to be there.
I was there, and I'm not complaining. It was great fun. But, you know, it's so intimidating as a guy because you got Dean Cain, Superman.
Well,
He's out
of
there
course.
with me.
Well,
and
he was
Lisa
there
Marie
just in
Booth.
case, of course.
And they offered
It's
us
a smart
blankets.
way to do it.
And he's like, you're not going to take a blanket, are you? No.
Like, yes, I am.
And I was waiting for him, and he finally kind of caved.
I would have snagged that blanket.
Kennedy called him out on it.
I
'cause
can't
she
believe
walked
Lisa
by.
didn't just go, give me that.
Yeah, and he had a blanket on at some point. So I'm like, if Superman's got a blanket and a cape, I can at least get a blanket.
Absolutely. I followed Dean Cain. I knew he was in charge.
Yeah, he did a great job.
All right, well, recreational pot shops are now open for business in California, with more than 6 dozen marijuana dealers licensed to start legally selling today, and folks all over the country could benefit. Marion.
Tens of millions of more people are now within the state of California legal cannabis consumers, but we can also serve anybody from any state or any country anywhere in the world as long as they're over 21 years old. So the entire state is going to benefit from cannabis legalization, not just cannabis consumers.
Marianne Rafferty is live in Los Angeles with more on this. Marianne?
Hi, Molly. The pot dispensaries that did receive that state license to go ahead and start selling to the public today had to go through a pretty long process that included approval by local jurisdictions and, of course, strict new rules for how it is sold.
It may not look like it, but this is marijuana. Candies, cookies, elixirs, and of course jar after jar of the smokable variety, all sold only as medicine. Until now.
It's going to change from dispensing medication and it's like, oh, I hope you feel better, to hey, enjoy the high.
That's because California has joined 5 other states that have legalized recreational pot, opening doors to the public and ushering in new rules and regulations.
Everything is going to have to be pre-weighed and sealed.
The owner of this dispensary has a lot of work to do because, unlike before, see-through packages like these are now prohibited. And for the first time, he must pay tax on every sale, leading to higher prices, which will get passed on to the consumer.
I expect a 30% increase because, first of all, we're going to be burdened with heavier taxation, and plus we're going to have to hire more staff.
Cannabis sales have been legal for 4 years in Colorado. Supporters say in spite of some early stumbles, government regulation works.
We can control it. We know who is producing it and who's selling it, and we know that they're following rules that will protect public health and safety.
Not to mention millions in new tax revenue for state and local governments. In California, lawmakers hope to collect $1 billion in 2018 and billions more in years to come. But opponents of legalization say it's not worth it.
What we've seen when that use increases is things like the traffic fatalities increasing, the use obviously of youth and adults increasing. We also look at things like ERs and hospitalizations and homelessness and a whole other realm of things that are unintended consequences from this legalization.
Now, California will have to wait and see what happens here. The new law comes with new rules. You have to be at least 21 to buy it. You can't smoke in public. And there are already road signs along many California highways reminding drivers that driving while high is still DUI. Molly?
I think that is a very fair reminder. Thank you, Marianne. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, a New Year's vacation unfortunately turning to tragedy. 5 members of an American family perish in a sightseeing plane crash. What authorities are saying you need to know now. Plus, Washington's big to-do list. Pivotal meeting taking place this week at the White House. What we can expect as a government shutdown looms.
We clearly have to get a budget passed in January and make it long term. But there are so many other subjects. We've got to worry about pensions, health care. I've been living in a hospital for the last 2 weeks with my husband. I cannot tell you how many people come to my room crying and scared to death. And we have to do DACA.
In 2018, we're just getting started.
The experts were all proven wrong. Do you see the message that you're sending?
Evidence the system is working.
We continue to expose the truth.
That is where the story begins.
The #1 name in news is Fox News Channel.
Ten Americans among 12 people killed in a fiery plane crash in Costa Rica yesterday. Among the dead, a family of 5 from suburban New York City. The plane slamming into a wooded area shortly after takeoff. The crash happened near Juan Santa Maria International Airport in the northwest part of the country, and our own Laura Ingle is covering this story for us from our New York City newsroom. Laura, such a tragic story around New Year's.
It is indeed, Ed, and we are learning heartbreaking details as some of the American victims have been identified. A mother and father from Scarsdale, New York, and their 3 sons were among those killed. According to published reports, Bruce and Irene Steinberg told friends they were looking forward to taking their sons William, Zachary, and Matthew on an adventure through Costa Rica. The family, known for being very involved in philanthropy and the local Jewish community, loved to travel the world together, a trip they had been looking forward to. The Steinbergs were on the last stop of their trip yesterday when their plane crashed into that wooded area near a popular tourist beach just after takeoff. 5 other Americans not yet identified and 2 local pilots were also on board. No one survived. There were reports of strong winds in the morning that forced a change in the itinerary, but the flight continued on its flight plan to San Jose. Now, this is the second fatal incident for the airline Nature Air in the last few months. In September 2017, an American and another passenger died on a Nature Air flight. The plane crashed minutes after taking off as well. There were reports of strong winds just on yesterday's flight, which we mentioned. That is something that investigators are definitely looking into. Now, according to aviation officials, the aircraft passed a safety inspection just 1 month ago.
The plane from the accident had recently been authorized about a month ago, so it was within the certification to operate as an airliner. For a plane, in this case the doomed plane, to be duly registered, it goes through an inspection for airworthiness and functionality that permits operations such as those it was carrying out up until today.
And Costa Rica's ex-president tweeted that one of the pilots was her cousin. Investigators are on the scene today looking into the cause of the crash. We'll bring you more as we get it here.
Such a heartbreaking story, Laura Ingle. Thanks for bringing it to us.
Ed.
All right.
Busy new year ahead for lawmakers. Democratic and GOP congressional leaders will meet Wednesday with top White House officials to discuss a deal aimed at avoiding this government shutdown that could be looming, as well as immigration, other top issues. This as President Trump will host Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell at Camp David this weekend. They're going to be plotting their 2018 agenda. Well, let's bring in our panel. Democratic strategist Jim Kessler is a former policy director for Senator Chuck Schumer, and Brad Blakeman, former deputy assistant to President George W. Bush. Thank you both for being here, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
When we kick off things, here comes January. There's a lot on the list just for January to avoid this government shutdown. One of the big things that's sort of at the center of all of this, there's the government shutdown, and the issue of immigration has blended right into this. Democrats say, we're not going to sign unless we get some help for the Dreamers, and the president also digging in, saying no DACA deal unless he gets what he wants as well. He's got a list: the wall, ending of chain migration. Pretty aggressive on both sides. So the big question is, who will actually bend? Brad?
Well, they're both going to have to bend because 2018 is going to have to be a year of compromise. Republicans need Democrats. The rules require it, especially in the Senate, to get legislation passed. But the good news is on the government shutdown, there's not going to be one. We're not going to start the year with a government shutdown. The bad news is we're just going to kick the can down the road again and meet up with this probably in the summer. But I think the aggressive nature of the Trump agenda is going to be infrastructure, where I think we can get a lot of Democratic support. DACA in solving once and for all this immigration problem of Dreamers. But there's enough compromise on both sides. Why? It's because Republicans and Democrats believe in strong borders. We also believe in a fair and equitable solution to DACA. So that's where compromise is a must.
Well, one hopes that each side would be able to find the middle ground. Jim, the Democrats, though, they're saying they're not going to sign in this bill to keep the government funded unless they get this fix related to the Dreamers. So if they dig in, will we see the government shutdown that is potentially there?
So there is a ticking timeline on DACA that is March, which is about the time when the government shutdown would occur too. And President Trump had promised that we're going to have a DACA solution by March. So these streams are coming together, naturally. Look, what the president has asked for in his latest tweet is 100% of what the president wants, and DACA is about 8% of the immigration problem. It's 800,000 of 10 million undocumented immigrants. So it's like, you can't say, look, I want LeBron James and I'm going to give you Lonzo Ball. Like Trump is going to have to move a little bit here because he's asking for everything and he's giving Democrats very, very little. I agree with Brad. This has to be the year of compromise. It has to be the year of bipartisanship because we don't have these situation where it's 50-vote majority in the Senate. Immigration is a place where this can get done. The president's got to move a little bit.
Interesting, you mentioned the year of compromise. Here we have the midterms looming, so we'll see what happens as they get closer and if compromise is potentially there. This upcoming weekend, the president expected to meet with Republican leadership to start talking about what their priorities will be, what they think they can actually accomplish. What do you think that agenda will actually look like? What do you think coming out of that meeting they'll be able to accomplish, Brad?
I think they're going to have a game plan, both in scheduling, when we can get this done before the Congress, because we're only talking about February, March, April, May, and June, because then both the House and the Senate are going to be up for re-election, a third of the Senate and every member of the House, and it's going to be every man and woman for themselves in trying to get re-elected. I would urge your viewers to pay close attention on January 30th to the President's State of the Union. That will be his roadmap. That'll be the agenda. That will be the challenge to Congress for the coming months. And I think it's going to be very aggressive.
Jim, shifting to you, when you talk about compromise, and this is the year that there has to be compromise, where will Democrats find it? And then will that be perceived as, because everyone wants the victory that they can crow about heading into the midterms when people head to the polls, who gets the win if you come to a compromise? That always seems to be the challenge in Washington. Nobody wants to give the other side a victory.
Right. Well, both sides have to get a win on this, and both sides have to get a loss on this. Look, the Republicans have a problem. They're going into the midterms. Their approval rating, wouldn't melt an ice cube. So they're looking at a bloodbath in 2018. And 2017 was a year in which Republicans really did not look to Democrats for help. They did everything on their own. There needs to be a change. The signal needs to come from President Trump, and it's got to be more than words. It's got to be deeds. He had the deal with Chuck and Nancy in September, and then he backed off. He really needs to reach out to Democrats. He needs to move to the center. They can do something on infrastructure. They can do something on spending. They can do something on immigration. It's not outside of his power, but he has to do it, and he's got to force Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan to move his caucus a little bit as well.
Jim, interesting you just mentioned a bloodbath. We have heard a lot of analysts talk about a potential blue wave, Brad, going into 2018. So does that make this year, before a potential blue wave, even more important for Republicans as far as what they can get done?
Absolutely. They need to run on their record. We control every facet of government, the White House and both houses of Congress. So it's incumbent upon us to have a record that we can run on. And that history is against us in the midterms. Since the Civil War, we've lost on average 32 seats in the House and 2 in the Senate. So history's not with us, but math is. Democrats are defending a lot more races, both House and Senate, and putting more money and spreading their resources thin. So if we have a good record, I think we'll be rewarded by the electorate come November.
And Jim, the final word, are there any concerns Democrats could be seeing a lot of victories coming up, that they could be complacent going into this election year?
I don't think you'll see Democrats be complacent. And one of the things you saw both in the Virginia race in governors, where Democrats won the governorship, and in Alabama, where Doug Jones won, is in these blue and purple and red states, Democrats nominated moderates. And if they are nominating moderates in purple and red areas in congressional districts and in Senate seats, they could have a very, very successful election in 2018. That is a broad path that they're taking. So I think Democrats feel optimistic about 2018. They ought to. That doesn't mean you can't get things done this legislative session.
Yeah, it's always interesting when elections feature the more fringe candidates, but we shall see who comes up to the plate in 2018. Jim Kessler, Brad Blakeman, thank you both for being here, and have a wonderful 2018.
You too. Thank you.
All right, meanwhile, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts promising to take a close look at the court's policies on sexual harassment. The pledge came as part of his annual review of the federal judiciary. Roberts saying events of the last few weeks have made it clear the bench is not immune to the problem that has spread to other industries. His comments come a few weeks after federal appeals court judge Alice Kaczynski resigned after multiple women came forward to accuse him of sexual misconduct.
The national anthem protests at NFL stadiums across the country. Now a federal court is weighing in on the issue when it comes to high school games, what its ruling was, and the implications now for the rest of the country. Plus, the Buffalo Bills doing something the team hasn't done in nearly 2 decades, and how fans are reacting. Buffalo Bills heading to the playoffs, ending the longest current drought in North American professional sports at 17 years. The Bills beating the Miami Dolphins yesterday, 22-16, but that wasn't quite enough. The Bills had to sweat it out, waiting to see if the Ravens lost so they could make it in. Touchdown. Check that out. That is joy right there. The locker room erupting, of course, in celebration after the Bengals took the lead from the Ravens, clearing the way for the Bills to head to the postseason and giving some joy to those long-suffering fans as well.
All right. Nice to see that locker room. National anthem protests were one of the biggest stories for the NFL in 2017. And right before the new year, a federal court in California ruled that a high school football player cannot be ordered to stand for the national anthem before games. The court saying the school district's rules violated the students' First Amendment right to political expression. Joining us now, Robert Bianchi, former head Morris County prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney, and Ashley Merchant, criminal defense and civil rights attorney. Happy New Year to you both.
Happy New Year, Ed.
Happy New Year.
Robert, I want to start with you. Okay, I understand what the court said. I understand what the law may say. On the other hand, why in the world can't you just say, let's respect the flag, let's respect men and women, let's stand for the anthem?
I'm a fan of doing that, Ed, absolutely. And it's funny because our constitutional government and the Supreme Court decisions, however, say that people don't have to be forced to believe in what it is that I believe in, i.e. stand up for the national anthem. And they basically said that you have a right under the First Amendment to protest, and that's what this comes down to. So a lot of times people conflate or confuse a legal issue with a political and a moral issue. And this court is basically saying this child, this kid, cannot be forced to stand up for the national anthem. And that is something that's been protected in the Constitution since cross-burning with the KKK, KKK protests, and all sorts of speech that we hate and find vile.
You know, Ashley, this was simmering and simmering throughout the NFL season. Some teams sort of found an accommodation where they might kneel, some players kneel before the anthem to express their free expression, as we all have and can and should do. But then everybody stand for the anthem. It seems like the NFL didn't really come up with a clear, coherent policy, and now it might be trickling down to college and football and high school football as well.
Right, definitely. And that's where these students are getting the idea from. They're watching these NFL players. They're wanting to emulate them. They're saying, we want to do this as well. The big distinction for the courts and what we're going to see going forward with this decision is that the NFL is a profit-based corporation. It's a private entity. It is not a government entity. When you're dealing with high school students and you're dealing with certain colleges, those are public schools. And when you've got kids that are forced, they're mandated to go to school, you've also got to have the same constitutional protections that you have in any other government run agencies. And so they've got the constitutional right to freedom of speech, where in the NFL, it's a different analysis. But I think what we're going to see going forward in this country is that any other high school that wants to impose some type of ban, like this high school in California did, they're going to now take a second look and say, you know what, this is not going to be allowed. We're not going to be able to continue to ban students from the right to expression and the right to free speech as long as it doesn't interfere with their educational goals.
And that's all well and good, but Robert, the coach can also say, I'm going to sit that player.
Well, if he does that, and getting back to the point, if government takes action, and this is a public school, and he penalizes somebody for exercising a known constitutional right to protest, which this is, then he's committing a violation under 42 U.S.C. 1983, which is our civil rights discrimination law, and he is subjecting himself in the school to massive civil liability and the payment of attorney's fees. So they would be wise not to have any retaliatory action for somebody exercising a constitutional right.
But when you start citing U.S. code like that, Ashley, have our sports just become warped now to the point that, if the coach wants to make a decision, we're going to have to go to the U.S. code?
Well, you've got to look at where this case started. It started by students heckling the student that actually filed this lawsuit and calling him racial slurs. And so, the coaches and the parents need to stand up and say none of that's okay. None of that's okay, because what happened is they started out with this bad sportsmanship policy, and then they took it too far and they instilled this rule that says you can't kneel during the national anthem. And so you've got to go back and just teach your kids the right thing to do, and then hopefully it doesn't ever get to the point where we've got to have the code involved. And hopefully the coach would set a good example, and the coach would teach these kids to do the right things, especially the coach of the kids that started this in the first place.
I got 15 seconds though. I wonder, what about when a coach, we've seen these cases in high schools and public schools, coach wants to say a prayer before the game and people freak out and say you can't do that. What if the coach said, well, that's my free expression, I want to share a prayer?
Yeah, well, the problem is that the coach can't place his expression of freedom of speech and freedom of religion on other people. And again, we get back to the same analysis. And listen, I think that we need prayer. I believe